Good morning. Bill Oliver here this morning. Got my coffee by the fireside. We got some questions kind of sent to us. We're going to try to answer some of those this morning. I have one question. It's a great one from Mackenzie in Nebraska. Mackenzie's question is, when starting colts, what is my opinion? Do I prefer a snaffle bit or a hackamore with a heavy Bosal, which is kind of an old traditional method of way of starting colts? So Mackenzie, I'm going to try to answer that question for you as good as I can, so here we go. Basically, I have to back up for a minute and kind of go back to the premise, the baseline of which our whole colt starting method is built upon. We drive these colts a lot with horses. We get them coming to pressure, facing up, coming to the inside of the round pen. I do a lot of work to get the colts where we're really handling them horseback, using a natural horsemanship approach, very similar to how one horse, a matriarch mare out in the wild, would drive some other horses. We believe that the premise is get those horses to come to pressure before they are asked to yield away. And it's really, that's a kind of a method that carries on through with the snaffle bit. When we take hold of one rein with a direct rein, we're actually pulling on the corners of the mouth, and we're asking that horse to come to pressure. So the psychological part of that, when we drive them in a round pen, is really getting them to face up, come to pressure before we ask them to yield away. We also do a ton of groundwork, sending them left, sending them right, getting them to clear their rib, disengage their hindquarters, flex their neck, and we do all that groundwork just in a halter and a lead rope. So this is just kind of one of my standard halters. Interestingly, when you look at this halter on the noseband, usually most of them are going to be about 7 inches over the noseband right here, and they're going to have the 2 buttons right here that ride on the cartilage of the horse's nose. If you were to compare that to an old, what I would call a traditional hackamore, meaning that it actually has a Feodor knot tied to it and a brow band here, this is the old traditional heavy type hackamore that was used to start colts way back when. If you look at the buttons on this Bosal right here and the noseband, it's very similar to the halter and the buttons there that we use. The reason that I stay with the very first ride with a halter and a lead rope like this is that I really, on that first ride, I don't want the riders really trying to operate the horses. I've seen so many wrecks over the years where people climbed on the colt, first ride, he's nervous, he doesn't know whether he's supposed to go forward, go backwards, turn to the left, turn to the right, or what he's supposed to do. We take all that out of the equation on the rider's part. I do it with my horse horseback. I move the horses out. I put mine on the shoulder. I get forward motion. I whistle, bring them to the inside, move my front end over and side pass my horse, thus giving the colt's release. And so that first ride is really way more about desensitization than it is actually operating that colt. I want that colt to be really relaxed with that saddle and with that rider up on their back. So I really do not want that rider doing a whole lot. I control them horseback, okay? So then it's quick on, and this is just the first day, and then pretty quick, I'm gonna go on day 2, I'm gonna go right to a snaffle bit like this. So I talked a little bit about that. When you pull on this one rein right here, this is a direct rein. Most of your riding starting out on these colts is gonna be all direct rein, either left or right, because we're only working on lateral flexion on the left side or the right side. On young colts, they're not ready to introduce a support rein yet and ask them to yield away from pressure. We're still just in the beginning asking them to come to pressure. And that's really going to be your shutdown. That's how you're going to clear the rib, flex that neck, and disengage those hindquarters when you are riding outside on those first rides. I eventually will get to a hackamore, and I love riding with a hackamore. I ride with a hackamore a lot. All of our colts and the 2-year-olds, we start them in a snaffle bit, or if they're 3 and they've never been started yet, we start those in a snaffle bit. But about 3.5, coming up on the end of that 3-year-old year and going into that 4-year-old year, I ride a lot in hackamores with Bosals. This is a heavy 3/4 inch one. I'll start with that. I'll go down to one like this that's a 5/8, and eventually clear down to a 3/8 Bosal, which is really light, that can be ridden with a 2-rein system when the horse is actually just carrying the bit. I think the Hackamore is one of the things. There's not that many Hackamore people out there anymore. A lot of people see all this rawhide and they see this horsehair and it's kind of intimidating. But the beauty of the Hackamore is really about getting that horse to yield away from pressure, unlike the Snaffle bit coming to pressure. So when I pull on this rein out to this side with a Hackamore, I'm actually putting pressure like this on the bridge of his nose and under his jaw. And so for the first time, even though I'm pulling with my rein here in my Makati rein, I'm actually pushing the horse here. I'm getting him to tuck that nose and move that jaw and everything like that. So I'm actually starting to push the horse as opposed to a Snaffle bit where we're really pulling the horse. Now, after quite a bit of riding with a Snaffle bit and you introduce a support rein, we're actually starting to push the horse a little bit too. But I transition to this and I ride all of my 3- and 4-year-olds at some point in time when they're cutting all their final set of teeth will be rode in this Hackamore. Now again, this is the traditional one. They can't pull it over the top of their head. This one here does not have a Feodor and that tied on it. This has a little more feel. Most of your Hackamore trainers will be riding in this, a little more release and a little more feel. But they can pull this over the top of their head. So anyway, the theory with that, and it's the same with the horsehair reins, when you put horsehair reins with a Hackamore against the horse's neck, you're starting to push that horse. Everything is starting to work in that direction to getting that horse refined down in here where you're neck reining. Now I'm kind of getting way on out past starting colts, and I hope I'm answering your question there. As far as how do I introduce the bit when I put a Snaffle bit in, well, I put it in their mouth. And how do I do that? I take my left thumb. I usually go into the corner of their mouth to get them. They'll usually gap their mouth a little bit. I put my hand up over the top between their ears and my fingertips, and I pull it right in. Initially, when I bridle up with colts the very first time, because I don't want to make them sensitive with their ears, I'll have my bridle kind of looser than where I want to ride with. I'll put it up in there, and then I will pull it on up in fairly snug initially for the first few rides into the corner of their mouth. I'll tighten it up, and the reason I do that is to try to kind of keep that where it's up in there snug so they're not running their tongue over the top of the bit. But they will a lot of times still run their tongue out over the top of it, and then they'll be back underneath it. If you put it pretty snug, most of the time the tongue will stay down underneath that bit. And so that's kind of how I introduce the bit into their mouth the first time. When I go to take that bridle off with the Snaffle bit, I do the same process. I'm really careful. A lot of times I'll unbuckle, drop my bridle one hole, loosen it up. Then everything slides off over their ears real easy, and I let the horse spit the bit. I don't try to pull it out or anything, and sometimes with colts the first time, they'll usually get working it with their tongue and they'll kind of spit that bit. If you will take and do it that way and be careful with your hands and how you do it, you'll never get your horse bad to bridle. So hopefully that answers your questions. I put the first ride in with a halter and a lead rope, but we're doing most everything with a horse. Then we go to a Snaffle bit. We get where we transition to the rider. We can shut down those hindquarters, which is really the engine that propels your horse forward. That's your brakes, if you will, getting started out on a young horse. And then eventually, once I get them pretty good in the Snaffle bit, I do switch to a Hackamore, and then I ride in the Hackamore.